January 8, 2020, Baghdad International Airport. 12:47 a.m. The runway lights cut through a haze of desert dust and exhaust. A convoy of black SUVs rolls slowly across the tarmac. Headlights off, engines low, moving with the deliberate caution of men who know they are being hunted. Inside the lead vehicle sits one of the most powerful men in the Middle East, a commander who has shaped wars from Beirut to Damascus, from Gaza to Baghdad. His phone is silent. His guards are alert but relaxed. He has survived decades of assassination attempts. Tonight feels routine. High above, invisible against the night sky, a US MQ-9 Reaper drone circles. Its operators sit thousands of miles away in a dim control room, watching thermal silhouettes glide across a monitor. No sound, no warning, only a blinking authorization code. Then the missiles fall. Two Hellfire strikes slam into the convoy with surgical precision. The first vaporizes the lead vehicle. The second engulfs the trailing cars in a column of fire. Metal twists. Ammunition cooks off in sharp, irregular pops. Burning fuel spreads across the asphalt like liquid sunlight. Within seconds, the man who commanded Iran's foreign wars is gone. Across the region, air defense crews snap to alert. Command centers flood with encrypted traffic. In Tehran, senior officials are shaken awake. In Washington, Situation Room monitors glow with confirmation images. The world has just crossed an invisible line. If the strike had failed, it might have been dismissed as another covert operation. If it had killed the wrong target, it could have triggered immediate escalation. But it succeeded perfectly, catastrophically, because the man killed was General Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iran's regional strategy and one of the most influential military leaders of the 21st century. And within hours, a far more dangerous question began to circulate through intelligence agencies and war rooms. What if this was not the end of a covert campaign, but the opening shot of a war? This is the story behind the crisis that pushed the United States and Iran to the edge of direct conflict, a confrontation that raised fears of a global war and forced both nations to consider an unimaginable scenario: the targeted killing of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Iran declared war. Why did America kill Iran's supreme leader? And the question that still haunts strategists today: how close did the world come to a conflict that neither side could control? Long before missiles struck that runway, the international system was already under strain. The post-Cold War order had begun to fracture. Great power competition was returning. Proxy conflicts were intensifying across the Middle East. Energy markets were volatile. Cyber warfare blurred the line between peace and conflict. For decades, the United States and Iran had fought a shadow war: sabotage, sanctions, covert operations, and proxy battles rather than open confrontation. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, diplomatic relations collapsed. Mutual hostility became institutionalized policy. Washington viewed Tehran as the primary destabilizing force in the region. Tehran viewed Washington as the architect of its isolation and economic strangulation. The 2015 nuclear agreement briefly reduced tensions, but when the US withdrew from the deal, pressure escalated rapidly. Sanctions crippled Iran's economy. Oil exports collapsed. Inflation soared. Domestic unrest simmered. Iran responded asymmetrically. Tankers were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz. Drone strikes targeted Saudi infrastructure. Proxy militias increased attacks on US forces in Iraq. Each move was calibrated aggressive enough to signal defiance, restrained enough to avoid full-scale war. But the margin for miscalculation was shrinking. Militarily, the imbalance was overwhelming. The United States possessed unmatched air power, global logistics, stealth technology, and precision strike capability. Iran lacked a comparable conventional force but compensated with ballistic missiles, naval swarming tactics, cyber capabilities, and a vast network of regional militias. Iran's strategy was not to defeat America outright. It was to make war prohibitively costly. A conflict would ignite the entire region from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean. Oil supply chains would collapse. Shipping lanes would become kill zones. Regional powers would be forced to choose sides. And hovering over all of it was the possibility of escalation involving Israel, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. War was not inevitable, but the system had become brittle. One decisive blow could shatter it. At the center of the crisis stood two men whose decisions would shape the trajectory of events. Power had to be demonstrated visibly, dramatically, and without hesitation. Hesitation invited challenge. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei represented continuity. Suspicious of the West, hardened by decades of confrontation, he believed survival depended on resistance and strategic patience. Unlike elected officials, he did not face voters. His time horizon was measured in decades, not election cycles. Between them stood Qasem Soleimani, a man who blended military command with political influence. He cultivated loyalty among proxy forces across the region. He was both general and diplomat, feared and admired in equal measure. To Iran's allies, he was a protector. To Iran's enemies, he was the mastermind behind attacks that had killed hundreds of Americans. Removing him was not just a tactical decision. It was a strategic gamble. Inside Iran's leadership circles, debate raged between pragmatists who feared catastrophic escalation and hardliners who believed confrontation was inevitable. Inside the U.S. administration, military planners presented options ranging from limited strikes to regime-threatening operations. Intelligence agencies warned that killing a figure of Soleimani's stature would trigger retaliation, but deterrence theory suggested the opposite. A decisive strike might shock Iran into restraint. Following the death of General Soleimani, two starkly different realities seemed possible. One where this was a decisive blow that re-established deterrence, and another where it was the spark that ignited a regional war. Only events would tell. Behind the scenes, the world's intelligence agencies went into overdrive. Surveillance assets tracked every militia movement across Iraq and Syria. Cyber units probed for weaknesses in critical infrastructure. Satellites repositioned to get a clearer view of Iran's missile bases. It was a silent global scramble for information. Iran, in turn, began to prepare for the worst. Key assets were dispersed, military facilities were hardened, and long-dormant contingency plans were activated. Revolutionary Guard units shifted to a full wartime footing. Their naval forces readied for a fight in the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf, a battlefield where geography gives them a powerful advantage. The Gulf is a choke point with predictable shipping routes. Coastal missile batteries can strike vessels with almost no warning, and mines can instantly turn vital sea lanes into naval graveyards. America's advantage, however, was its incredible reach. Carrier strike groups, stealth bombers, and a global logistics network allowed it to concentrate overwhelming force anywhere on the planet, and fast. Adding to the tension were the alliances. Regional partners, while relying on U.S. protection, were terrified of becoming the battleground. European allies pleaded for de-escalation. Russia, ever the opportunist, positioned itself as a potential mediator while quietly working to expand its own influence in the chaos. Meanwhile, an information war raged. Both sides pumped out narratives for their own people and for the world, each framing their actions as purely defensive, a necessary response to the other's aggression. But beneath the public posturing, the war machines were getting ready for something far more serious than just words. Then, the day came when everything changed. For Iran, Soleimani's death was a test of its very credibility. If they didn't respond, they would look weak to their allies and their enemies. But if they overreacted, they risked a devastating American counterattack. On January 8, 2020, Iran made its move. Ballistic missiles were launched at 2 Iraqi bases housing U.S. forces. As sirens screamed across the desert, soldiers scrambled into bunkers. Moments later, massive explosions lit up the night sky. For the first time in decades, Iran had directly attacked American troops. But the strikes were meticulously planned. Advance warnings, passed through intermediaries, helped minimize casualties. The message was clear and unmistakable. We can hit you, but we do not want a total war. Now Washington faced its own dilemma. Should it retaliate with overwhelming force and risk a massive regional conflict? Or should it absorb the hit, showing restraint to maintain control? For hours that felt like days, the world held its breath and waited. Military commanders drew up plans for strikes on Iranian air defenses, missile sites, and command centers. Oil markets went haywire. Airlines frantically rerouted flights away from the region. Governments around the world issued emergency advisories to their citizens. Inside the White House, the debate was intense. A major attack could cripple Iran's military, but it could also trigger the very war everyone had desperately tried to avoid. In the end, the United States chose not to escalate militarily. On the surface, the crisis seemed to cool down, but deep down, something fundamental had shifted. The unwritten rule against directly targeting another nation's senior leaders had been shattered. Initially, casualties from the missile strikes were reported as minimal. Later, it was revealed that dozens of U.S. personnel had suffered traumatic brain injuries. The damage to the bases was significant, but the psychological impact was profound. Politically, both governments claimed victory. Iran told its people it had stood up to America and retaliated. The United States told its people it had eliminated a dangerous adversary without getting dragged into a full-scale war. Economically, the uncertainty sent shockwaves through global markets. Energy prices spiked, and insurance rates for shipping in the Gulf skyrocketed. Diplomatically, nothing was resolved. No treaty was signed. The conflict simply retreated back into the shadows. But strategists everywhere continued to study those few days in January, because the crisis revealed just how quickly two powerful nations could stumble toward the brink of an unthinkable war. One of the most dangerous elements was miscalculation, the assumption that both sides see the world the same way. American planners believed their targeted strike would restore deterrence, but Iranian leaders saw it as undeniable proof that Washington was coming for them, seeking total regime change. Iran believed its calibrated missile strike would satisfy its people without provoking a massive U.S. response, but American commanders worried it was just the first wave of a much larger attack. In a crisis, perception is reality. Every action is filtered through layers of fear, ideology, and incomplete intelligence. Another critical vulnerability was communication. With no direct diplomatic channels, messages had to pass through third parties, making them slower, less precise, and far more likely to be misunderstood. Think about it. If the casualties from the missile strikes had been higher, political pressure in the U.S. could have forced a much harsher response. If Iran had mistaken American restraint for weakness, more attacks might have followed. War rarely begins with a single, deliberate decision. It often starts as a chain reaction of misjudgments and unexpected outcomes. The legacy of that crisis extends far beyond those few tense days. Militarily, it highlighted the terrifying power of modern precision strike capabilities. The ability to find and eliminate a single high-value target almost anywhere on Earth is a game-changer. But it also proved the power of asymmetric strategy. A nation without a global military reach can still pose a serious threat to a superpower using missiles, proxies, and the simple advantage of geography. Politically, the event reshaped strategic thinking across the Middle East. America's allies began to question how reliable their security guarantees really were. Its adversaries carefully studied just how far they could push before provoking a response. Future conflicts will undoubtedly draw lessons from this confrontation. The very idea of targeting a nation's supreme leader, once unthinkable, has now entered the realm of strategic discussion. Such an act wouldn't just be a military strike. It would be seen as a civilizational attack, potentially unleashing a spiral of retaliation that no one could control. Modern warfare isn't just fought on battlefields anymore. It unfolds across computer networks, financial systems, energy markets, and the court of public opinion. A single strike can send ripples across the entire globe in seconds. Today, tensions between major powers continue to simmer. Proxy conflicts burn on. The risk of nuclear proliferation hasn't gone away. The fundamental conditions that led to the 2020 crisis are still with us. They've just evolved. History rarely tells you when a turning point is happening. You usually only recognize it long after, when you're living with the consequences. On that night in Baghdad, as flames engulfed the wreckage on the runway, no one knew if they had just witnessed the end of a long shadow war, or the beginning of something much, much bigger. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the crisis didn't end because the conflict was resolved. It ended because both sides took a step back from the edge at the very last second. If one missile had landed differently, if one decision had been made under more pressure, if one leader had chosen escalation over restraint, the Middle East and perhaps the world could look very different today. A war between the United States and Iran was not fought, but for a few days in January 2020 it was closer than most people will ever realize. And the shadow of that near war still hangs over us. It's a chilling reminder that in our age of precision weapons and instant communication, history can pivot not over years or months, but in a matter of minutes. Sometimes, the most important wars are the ones that almost happened. Because next time, we might not be so lucky. The step back might not come. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis interesting, be sure to subscribe for more.